What is the French colonial pact? The more I read about this subject, the angrier I get about how this is still a thing. I'm also dumbfounded, as someone who was born in Africa and grew up in Europe, I never learned or heard about this while it still affects so many Africans. In the last video, I mainly talked about how it started. A bit of history as to why so many French-speaking African countries saw no other option than to sign this pact in exchange for some freedom. Please check it out for some background information. In this video, I am going to talk about what that pact actually means and which countries still pay it. I encourage you to share this video because this is unacceptable in 2020. We need to hold France accountable or at least start a conversation. This still is free forced labor, aka another form of slavery. France just bullied so many countries in submission and still does to this day. So what is the French colonial tax? While researching this topic, I came across a few articles that clarified all the consequences of this pact. The emphasis is mainly on the currency these countries use and its advantages and disadvantages. More on that later, but it is much more than that. Fortunately, I came across an article by Angeline Mbogo. She has made a list of what this colonial pact entails and it's just crazy. I'll link to the full articles in the descriptions below. Angeline starts off her article by writing about how several African countries have been under the French influence for 75 years because France still is unable to let its colonies go. France continues to exploit African countries with unfair obligations, one of which has raised a raging debate over the years. The so-called colonial tax is this infamous obligation that requires them to keep 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in operations account held at the French treasury. We'll talk more about that later because there is so much more to this pact. But first, here is a list of the obligations that France subjected to some ex-French colonies under the colonial pact include, 1. Paying for the infrastructure France built during colonization. The so-called benefits Africa gained from the colonial time, France must have left some hefty infrastructure over there that it's worth paying for 75 years, excuse my sarcasm. 2. Keeping 50% of their foreign reserves in the French treasury. 14 African countries have been doing this for years. Interestingly, these countries can only access 15% of their reserves each year. If they need more, they have to borrow it. Can you imagine? France allows them to access only 15% of the money in any given year. If they need more than that, they have to borrow the extra money from their own 65% from the French treasury at commercial rates. Let me know in the comments if you'll be interested in a deal like this and I'll send you my bank account. Jokes aside, this is fucked up and then we wonder why Africa remains underdeveloped and poor. To make things more tragic, France imposes a cap on the amount of money the countries could borrow from the reserve. The cap is fixed at 20% of their public revenue in the preceding year. If the countries need to borrow more than 20% of their own money, France has a veto. 3. France has also the first right to purchase any natural resources discovered. France called dibs on all the natural resources. These countries cannot participate in a normal economy. As long as France has this power, it also has the power to fix the purchase price. There is no fair competition possible between buyers just because France called dibs on any natural resources. One article describes it as France having the first right to buy any natural resources found in the land of its ex-colonies. It's only after France would say, "I'm not interested," that the African countries are allowed to seek other partners. 4. French companies also have dibs on all government procurement bids, just because, well, if you can call dibs on everything, why not this too? It means that in the award of government contracts, French companies must be considered first, and only after that these countries could look elsewhere. It doesn't matter if the African countries can obtain better value for money elsewhere. 5. Senior military officers are trained in France, because it makes indoctrination possible, the process of teaching a person or group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically, basically brainwashing. Another article states that the reason for this would be so that France can discipline hundreds, even thousands of spies, and nourish them. They stay dormant when they are not needed, and activated when needed for a coup or any other purpose. Of course, there is no proof for this argument, but I'm certain that France wasn't thinking about giving the countries that wanted independence the best military training out there. It was a strategic move to keep power over those countries. The same article also points out that during the last 50 years, a total of 67 coups happened in 26 countries in Africa. 16 of those countries are French ex-colonies, which means 61% of the coups happened in Francophone Africa, and this is sadly a fact. African leaders who protest are killed or become a victim of a coup. Those who obey are supported and rewarded by France with a lavish lifestyle while their people endure extreme poverty and despair. It's such an evil system, even denounced by the European Union, but France is not ready to move from that colonial system which puts about $500 billion from Africa to its safe year in year out. 6. France has the right to deploy its military in the African countries. 7. Countries have to make French the official language and the education language. I still remember this very well. From kindergarten, on day 1, all lessons were taught in French. In primary school, when you start to learn how to read and write is when you receive a class about your mother language. You learn to write in your native language, but even this class was taught in French. What better way to make generation after generation to forget their cultures and ways? This totally not another form of indoctrination. Can you imagine that you were born in an English-speaking country and you get all your classes in French from day 1, even English? That, if you have a question, in that one class about English, that you had to formulate your question in French. Like, can you imagine? At the time it all seemed normal since that was all anew. I started to ask myself questions when I arrived in a country where it is the complete opposite. 8. They were forced to keep using the French colonial currency, the FCA. Fun fact, FCA used to stand for Franc des Colonies Françaises d'Afrique, which translates to franc from the French colonies in Africa. The franc was a currency used in France before the euro. So they made one especially for their colonies. How sweet, right? 9. The former colonies have to send a reserve report to France. 10. Ex-colonies cannot enter into military alliances with other countries without approval from France. But France has no power over those countries, right? It's definitely not a way to keep Africa divided. 11. Ex-colonies are required to join forces with France during war or global crisis. Free soldiers when you need them, always handy. I need to stop this video in order to keep my sanity intact. This gets me angry. I live currently in a European country. I enjoy living here, but I can't forget the fact that Europe was built on the blood of my ancestors and the fact that it keeps happening and no one is moved by it. I'll definitely look into the coups that I talked about, but that's for another day. Here is a map of the countries bounded by this pact. Let's end with famous quotes from French leaders on this matter. It all started in 1958, when 95% of Guineans voted no to Charles de Gaulle's proposal. The French went for what they called a divorce without alimony. Better said, Guinea finally found the courage to escape an abusive forced marriage. In 1957, former President François Mitterrand already predicted that, without Africa, France will have no history in the 21st century. Last but not least, in 2008, another former French president, Jacques Chirac, said, without Africa, France will slide down into the rank of a third world power. France needs to stop taking advantage of these countries, these people, and we need to talk about this. Please check the description below to read the full articles. See you in the next video. Until then, for all the Netflix lovers out there, please check out the series Black Earth Rising as it touches some of those subjects. Plus it's well done with a lot of suspense.